Hey everybody, welcome back. So this last lecture, I feel like I'm finally able to share some of my own research on emerging adults, particularly college undergraduates, and the ways that they experience and work through spiritual struggle. I could have shared this information for you probably earlier in the course. But I think with the reading that you've been doing and the frames and the ideas that I've been trying to propose to you, I feel like you're almost up to speed now, where some of the things that I'm going to say to you, you're going to be like, oh, that makes sense because of what we read, because of what we talked about. And so I hope that there's actually some familiarity that you see with this, but we can actually direct this toward the emerging adult undergraduate experience and to talk a little bit about that. So let me just explain to you a little bit about this. Now we know that undergraduates, first of all, are sort of at the front stages of emerging adulthood, right? I mean, they're going to be 18 to 24, generally speaking. Though that is obviously changing, there's something quite unique about that. But this is what we know about undergraduate spiritual struggle as we look in a lot of different places and a lot of different literature, that we know from the research that a reality affects a considerable portion of students. Like most students have some sort of spiritual struggle if they've come from some sort of faith orientation. We also know that it's a necessary part of spiritual development. We've already talked about that with faithing, right? Remember, faithing and doubting are friends, they're not enemies. It actually impacts their academic, emotional, and social well-being, right? So there's something actually quite dramatic about this idea that there's something going on here where it can actually impact not only their faithing process as though it's sort of this private thing, but it actually can usurp like their whole living and even their work as a college student. And so this can have a result on retention and attrition. We know from the literature that what keeps students, undergraduates in school are two things. One is what would be called academic integration. Academic integration is when a student, an undergraduate, does their schoolwork and they pass their courses. There's an integration where they're being successful in the academic part of their lives. But that's only half of what keeps undergraduates around. The second part is this idea of uh, of, uh, of social integration. Okay, social integration is how I connect myself with others, how I feel supported, where my friends are coming from, and all that comes with that. So those two together really can have a dramatic effect. So if I think about my faithing, if it's more than intellectual, if it's emotional and relational, and I'm not feeling a connection with the community that I'm a part of, it actually can have a dramatic effect on an undergraduate's faithing, their doubting, the spiritual struggle that they go through, and actually can impact whether they stay or leave that particular college. Pretty dramatic when you think about it, which makes this really, really important. Now, let me just give you some definitions that I think are really, really helpful. You've probably heard or read sort of this distinction of religious and spiritual, right? Sometimes we've maybe heard that young people are spiritual but not religious, though that has been challenged in a number of different ways. And I just want to give you a quick definition of how I use these terms. When it comes to religion or to be religious, it describes the cultural background and worldview narrative that contributes to the way one makes meaning of one's daily experiences and practices. Okay, so like if you listen to somebody, no matter where they think they're at spiritually right now, oftentimes the way they reference God, the way they reference church, the way they reference the scriptures gives you an indication that they are part of some sort of religious tradition that they've been a part of that has somehow influenced their language, right? Like religion and being and sort of religiousness is the language and the scaffolding that allows me to articulate what's going on inside. Okay, now spirituality, or to be spiritual, describes one's meaning-making efforts that inform the way one lives and relates to the world and others, transforming a person toward the telos or the goal of a more mature, congruent, and faithful way of living. Now, this probably isn't a surprise to you, right? This sounds a little bit like faithing, right? It's this ongoing work of me integrating my life and my beliefs in such a ways that I can live faithfully into what I believe my life is truly all about. Now, spiritual development is not a surprise. Really, I won't even read all of this for you, but it really is the key piece of one maturing in one's faith trajectory that comes with that. And then in the green part here, the intensity of spiritual development is often most evident in the pivotal moments described as spiritual struggle. Okay, so spiritual struggle is in many ways this place of faith, of faithing and doubting, this doubting piece where there's something quite dramatic that happens that invokes a need to take a risk, to step out of the boat, to explore something that I haven't explored before, to deconstruct something in order to reconstruct something, right? This is a key piece with that, which leads us then to this idea of spiritual struggle, where these are the critical moments people experience when they realize that their spirituality must change to accommodate new experiences and information. Now, remember we talked about before the difference between assimilation and accommodation, right? Remember that last week? When I assimilate, everything kind of fits the way I think the world works. When I accommodate, everything has to be broken apart, and I have to build a bigger container for the way that I think the world works. And that's where spiritual struggle resides. Okay, so what we know from literature in higher ed, we know that spiritual struggle is often its understanding is way too generalized. When someone says they're struggling, generally, like, how you doing? I'm struggling. Like, what goes through your mind? I started as I dug into this, like, struggling with what? Struggling how? Is this intellectual? Is it emotional? Is it relational? Are you giving up on God? Are you just trying to figure out God better? Like, but sometimes when we talk about it in like ministry settings, it's like, yeah, so and such, Steve's really struggling. Oh, wow, Steve's struggling. I guess we should pray for him. Yeah. But we don't really know what to do with it, right? So we need like a more particular language to address what's actually going on. And what makes this hard is that young adults' spiritual experiences are often hidden from adults, leaders, and educators. In student development, there's a difference between day campus and night campus, okay? Day campus is the place where students go and they show up at their classes, they raise their hand, they do their discussion posts. It's the overt places that students are expected to show up because that's where the learning particularly happens, right? They're the organized spaces of connection. But night campus are the non-prescribed places that students show up to make meaning. These are in the hallways, in the dorm rooms. They're in the bedrooms of the apartments. They're in the bars on Main Street. They're in the small groups that meet in the corner of campus. They are the dinners that friends have together, right? Night campus is where students actually probably spend more time actually working through the things that they want to work through. Why? Well, day campus and the classroom are actually high risk. You're not necessarily going to raise the questions that you really have because you don't want to expose yourself that way to the criticism of others or to be embarrassed about what's going on. So sometimes what happens is that students will be like, I'm not going to raise my hand in class, but I'm going to ask my friend as soon as I walk out, right? This is one of the reasons why whenever I preach or teach or whatever, I try to show up early and I try to stay late. You know why? Because the real conversations probably happen before and after the formal time. It's really, really interesting to think about that. This is why I also find it very interesting with emerging adult ministry that we are so worried about emerging adults so showing up at church. Is that day campus or night campus? Day campus, right? What if they are actually trying to make sense of their worlds and our faithing in night campuses all over the place? Maybe that's what we need to pay attention to. Now, what I'm not saying about that is to like turn night campus into day campus. That's like grandparents going on Facebook, right? Like it used to be where college students were, then all the grandparents showed up, and now nobody's on Facebook anymore, right? That's like day campus like invaded night campus, and that wasn't good. So I'm not saying that we necessarily need to show up in the night campus places, but we certainly better be aware of them, right? Where are the places that emerging adults are trying to make sense of their worlds, and how can I be attuned to that? Because perhaps that's actually the places where the meaning making has happened, not in day campuses or the prescribed or organized places that we think they actually are. Pretty interesting to think about. I wonder how that changes our job descriptions if we actually pay attention to that. Okay, we know that in higher ed, spiritual struggle has been limited. It's one of the most challenging parts of spiritual development. and it has lots of different names. If you look at all types of religious and student development literature, there's suffering, betrayal, doubt, questioning, anger at God, despair, crisis, dark night of the soul, disorienting experience, pivotal moments. Some of you have brought this up to me. The idea of shipwreck has been really powerful in your thinking, or conversion, right? These are all sort of factors that are used in thinking about this. So already we have so many terms trying to understand what spiritual struggle is. What we know is that it affects a lot of students. It's necessary for spiritual development, as I mentioned before, and it impacts their well-being, as I mentioned before. So what I did is, in my literature, is I thought about this as I started to look at how evangelical undergraduates make sense of their worlds, and then I also looked at undergraduate spiritual struggle in the work that there. And so my focus on my research was evangelical undergraduates and the ways that they were thinking about spiritual struggle. And here's my research question. From the perspective of undergraduate students who have come from an evangelical Christian tradition, what factors support or impede their experiences when working through spiritual struggle while at colleges? Okay, so I wanted to know, like, what happened? What was that like for you? How did you work through it? And so that's the work that I did. And here's was my participants. They were juniors and seniors of selected Midwest Public University. They self-identified as having come from an evangelical or conservative Christian tradition, and they self-identified as experiencing a shift or change in their religious or spiritual beliefs or practices. I was very, very intentional to not ask them if they struggled spiritually, because I think in a lot of traditions, again, because of what we learned last week with Peter and sinking and everything else, people don't want to talk about that. Like, they're not going to tell you that they struggle spiritually. But I asked them, was there a shift or change in your religious or spiritual beliefs or practices? And they were really open to talking about those shifts and changes. So my study included just over about 20 participants with in-depth interviews that I did. About half were men and women. Some other comparative studies of some studies similar to mine had less population than I did, and also less men. So I feel like mine was a little bit more representative and a little bit more robust, which is always a good thing. With regards to their backgrounds, they came from intact and stable homes. They told me that their parents tried to live out and pass along their religious tradition, okay, which isn't completely surprising. And the advice that they got when they went off to college from their parents, these students said, was this: college is a hostile place to their faith, so find a campus religious group as fast as you can. Okay, that was the advice. Okay, just keep that in mind. That'll come back a little bit later. When we asked them, like, what was their non-academic involvement, right? What did they do? And they said they were involved in campus religious groups or a church, or non-religious involvement like athletics, work, or volunteering. Their average non-academic involvement was about 18 hours a week. So I think what we could say is that these students were invested and quite busy. When I asked them, like, what contributed to their spiritual struggle, they said a number of things, but these were the top ones. There was educational or classroom experiences where something happened in the classroom that was disorienting for them. They also said that finding friends and connecting relationally evoked some spiritual struggle for them. Remember what I said before about the intellectual, emotional, relational. Do you see what's interesting here? That they were struggling with finding friends, and it had an effect on their faith. Okay. There was also dating topics that came up, or having sex, or even sexual assault that obviously caused crisis. Sometimes it was philosophical. Sometimes it had to do with substance abuse. Sometimes it was actually just campus religious groups. Like, that actually caused the struggle along the way. And then sometimes, especially for women, just the wrestling with faith and gender roles, maybe things that they've heard from their churches and what they actually, the experiences that they were getting at their schools. When it came to on-campus contributors, which is sort of the experiences that they had on campus, I'm sorry, off-campus contributors, the other one was on campus. They said family death or illness, that's obviously caused some disorientation. Sometimes just going home and sort of having to re-engage family or friends. And again, even assault came up there as well. And then I asked, well, what contributed to you working through spiritual struggle? And they said, well, what was really helpful were my friends, campus religious group mentors, and sometimes even faculty and class resources. Off campuses, they said, well, we tried to figure it out on our own, sometimes parents and family, sometimes a counselor and this therapist, and sort of way down on the bottom somewhere was this idea of church. So what was really interesting, if I could summarize what I just said to you, we sort of have these contributors and resources for spiritual struggle. And then we had on campus and off campus experiences, right? When they're on campus, these are factors. When they're off campus, these are sort of all the things orbiting their campus experiences. And the top contributors, again, on campus were educational or classroom experiences, finding friends or connecting relationally, or family death or illness. The way they tried to work through it, most predominantly on campus was friends, and most predominantly off campus was on their own. Now, as a researcher, I found this really, really interesting, right? Like, wow, okay, so here is what's contributing, and here are where students are going to find answers. I think as a pastor, this was really, really troubling to me because you know, resources as friends is great, but if like you have two 20-year-olds who are friends trying to figure out maybe some really dramatic things that are going on in their lives, um, they have like similar life experiences. There's not like a lot of wisdom, extra wisdom attended, offered in those moments simply because they're in the same place in life. So there's a limitation from what they can get from their friends as far as maybe solving the problems, even though they are reaching out, which is really, really great. I think what's interesting is that off campus is the way I describe it. The way they try to figure it out was on their own. And and to me, I mean, this just seems like a really lonely experience of them discovering or experiencing and working through spiritual struggle. And maybe they'd go to a friend, but a lot of times they'd work it out on their own. And I was really, really kind of struck by that. Another piece that contributed to this was as I talked with these participants, and I asked them about their experiences, they said to me, nobody's ever asked me about this. Oh, Steve, you're the first person I've told about this. And I'm like, I'm just a researcher guy. Like we just met. And you're saying that because I took an hour with you and I asked you these questions, you are opening up and sharing these deep and profound things. It seems to me like at least these undergraduates were really looking for someone that would actually be aware of what they were going through and maybe would actually reach out for the help that's offered if they knew it was there, which is quite profound to think about, that there's sort of this loneliness um, embedded in the experiences that they're having with spiritual struggle. So here's some things to just think about. I'm going to pause on this. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop for this particular round. As you reflect on these findings, what strikes you? What do you wonder about? What story might this tell for you in these situations? Or maybe it has, maybe you can relate to some of it. I mean, what story does it tell about your own story? Um, for your ministry context, where is day campus and night campus? It's really interesting to think about, isn't it? And then also, what kind of support do emerging adults need for their faithing and spiritual quests? Right? What do they really need in this moment as we think about this research and what we've been reflecting on this week? These are not easy answers. These are not simple topics, but I do think that if at least we're open to turning these concepts in some different ways, it evokes in us an imagination, um, and an appreciation for the complexities and the needs of emerging adults in ways that are much more particular and, in my estimation, much more human. Um, uh, and I think when we begin to think about it that way, perhaps we can be more particular about the good news they're searching for and the people they want to accompany them as they seek out these answers. So I hope that's helpful. I have more to say about undergraduate spirituality. We'll get to that, but I think for now, I hope this was helpful. And thanks so much for engaging in these particular lectures. It's exciting to know that we can have these conversations at a deeper level because of the work that you've done up to this point. And so until we meet again, grace and peace.